Hello everyone and welcome to the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub webinar, Humid Heat in a Changing Climate and What It Means for Our Health. We'll just wait a few minutes for people to join, but it's really great to have you all here today. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Ramona Dolpoza and I'm the Climate Systems Hub Knowledge Broker. And I work from the University of Tasmania with a team of knowledge brokers in the hub in states and territory governments. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about our Humid Heat webinar today, because growing up in North Queensland and then moving south to Melbourne, I've noticed how hard it is to stay cool on a 35-degree day when the humidity is high. And as our climate changes and the temperatures are increasing, we can expect dry heat extremes to increase across Australia. However, as we explore today, the expected changes to humid heat events aren't that well understood. Can I just change, and I'll do a change a slide, please, and I'll start with the acknowledgement of country. Thank you. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where we're joining from today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to extend the respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. In the Hub, we recognise the important role that traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give a quick background to the Hub Climate Systems Hub webinars. We designed them to provide an opportunity for sharing and learning. And so far we've had a great range of presentations, and you can find all the recordings from our previous webinars on our website, as well as fact sheets like this one explaining humid heat. So please have a look. And just a few housekeeping notes before we get started again. This webinar is being recorded. The link will be available from the NESP Climate Systems Hub website after the webinar, and we'd encourage you to ask questions. This can be done anytime by typing them in the Q&A function. We will address as many questions as possible later in the session, but I really encourage you to get in early. We don't always have time to address all the questions, but we really want to hear from you. All right, so for today's webinar, we're really lucky to have our Hub researcher, Dr. Cassandra Rogers, to explain how the Hub's research is improving our ability to understand extreme humid heat events, and also our special guest today, Professor Ollie J, who will also explore how they impact our health and what we can do to prepare for them in the future. So without any further delay, I'd like to warmly welcome our first speaker, Dr. Cassandra Rogers. She is a climate scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology. She studies heat extremes and compound events, including heat waves and humid heat, with the aim of better understanding how these events have changed over time and how they will change in the future. Her research is supported by the NESP Climate Systems Hub and also the Australian Climate Service. So I'll let you share your screen, Cass, and over to you.
Great, thanks, Ramona. Okay, I'm going to assume the slides are working fine, but yell out if they're not. Thanks. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for joining today. As Ramona said, my name's Cass, and I work at the Bureau of Meteorology. And today we're talking about humid heat in the recent past. So when we think about heat, the different types of heat can affect our body differently. So if we think of a hot, dry day, we start to feel hot, we start to sweat. As the sweat evaporates, it takes heat away from the body and we feel cooler. But if it's hot and humid, when we still sweat, but because there's all this moisture in the atmosphere, less of that sweat can evaporate, and so we stay hotter than if the air was dry. And so Ollie will expand on the health effects here in his talk, but just to sort of set the context, this is why it's really important for us to understand humidity as well as temperature changes. So we have a really good understanding of how dry heat extremes are changing. We know that heat waves are getting hotter, longer, and more frequent. We know that average temperatures are increasing, and we know that extreme temperatures are increasing. So these changes are generally well understood. However, when it comes to humid heat, while we know that humid heat extremes have increased in many locations around the world, there's just a lot less research in this area, and so changes are just generally less well understood than for dry heat. There's a number of different ways of measuring humid heat. So you may have heard of some of these. There's wet bulb temperature, heat index, universal thermal climate index, wet bulb globe temperature, and some others. But for my talk, I'm just going to focus on wet bulb temperature. And that's because it's one of the more simple of these metrics, and also has the advantage that we can measure it directly. And so to do that, we use a wet bulb thermometer. And so it's basically, if you just take a regular thermometer, or what we call a dry bulb thermometer, and you put a damp cloth around the bulb at the bottom, what happens is as the thermometer or the temperature increases, water evaporates from the cloth, and then the thermometer ends up being cooler. This carries heat away, the water carries heat away, and the thermometer is cooler than it would be otherwise. So this is the same thing that happens when we sweat, the moisture carries heat away from the body as we sweat. The same thing is happening for a wet bulb thermometer. So here I've plotted the frequency of humid heat events. So by that, I mean the sort of the top 5% of days per year, that's what we're considering humid heat. So on the x-axis here, we have just the year. This is from 1979 to the present day, or the end of 2024. And then on the y-axis, we have the frequency. So this is the number of humid heat days. And so for Sydney, we can see over time, we're getting this gradual increase in the frequency of humid heat days. I've also plotted Adelaide, Melbourne, and Broome here, and we can see similar increases in each of these cities. We can also see from this plot that 2024 was quite high in terms of the number of humid heat days. So for Adelaide, we can see this was the highest year since 1979. But for Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide, we also had these values that were much above average. So average being that grey line sort of in the middle of each plot. And so this, I don't know about where everyone on the call is from, but for me in Melbourne, this matches my experience of last year or the current summer, where it's felt quite hot and humid compared to what I'm used to. You might also be wondering why these plots start in 1979, because a lot of these stations go back further, quite a bit further than 1979, but this is just to match with some data I'm going to be showing later in the talk. So as well as looking at the frequency of humid heat, this plot here looks at the intensity of the humid heat days. So it's sort of looking at the temperature of the top 5% of the 5% of events per year. So we've still got the year on the x-axis at the bottom, but now on the y-axis, we've got wet bulb temperature. And so we can see again, for Sydney, this gradual increase in wet bulb temperature intensity over time. We also see a similar pattern happening in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Broome with this increasing trend. And again, 2024 is showing up as well above the average for all of the cities, but particularly Adelaide, we've got this record since 1979, and possibly also for Melbourne, it's right up there as well. So far, the results I've shown have all been from our Bureau weather station data, but the observational data, as well as coming from weather stations, can come from many other sources. So this includes aeroplanes, ocean buoys, weather balloons, ships, satellites, a lot of other sources. However, no matter how many of these observational instruments we have, we're going to get a sort of patchy spatial coverage. So that picture on the map on the bottom there, we can see, so this is not all of the Bureau's weather stations, it's just a sample, but you can see it's sort of some areas where there's not a lot of data. So if we want to get a picture of what's happening over the whole country, we take all of the observational data, so from the satellites and stations and everything, and we can use a model to sort of fill in the gaps. And this produces a nice gridded product where we've got data everywhere, and this is what we call reanalysis data. And so when we take reanalysis data, because wet bulb temperature isn't one of the metrics that's calculated in reanalysis data for whatever reason, but that means we have to calculate wet bulb temperature ourselves. And so we do that by taking normal, just dry bulb temperature, humidity data and surface pressure, and then we can calculate wet bulb temperature ourselves. And we do this using some code that we developed at the Bureau of Meteorology, and you can download that code at this link if you're interested, if that's the sort of thing you do in your own work. So these are the plots I showed earlier, the frequency of humid heat events, but now we can also show them in map form. So in the center of these plots is where the station is located. Each of these are at the airports for each of these cities. But now we can see not just what's happening at that airport location, but we can see what's happening around the station as well. We can also see that the reanalysis data in the maps matches what's happening in the stations at the top. So we've got positive trends. The orange colours in the maps indicate a positive trend or an increase in the frequency of humid heat days. We can also do the same thing for wet bulb temperature intensity. Again, we're getting fairly similar trends with these increases for each of these locations, but we can also see in these maps some areas where we might be getting a slight decrease in the intensity of these wet bulb temperature events. So that's the areas that are blue on this map. So in the Sydney map, that's right at the top and the bottom of the figure. However, while there might be this slight decrease in the temperature, we're still getting this increase in the number of the events. So it's a bit of an increase in one metric, decrease in the other. If we want to put this into the global context, this is some other research I've done. It's got on the x-axis, we've got the year. This is going from 1979 now to 2019. And then on the y-axis, we've got the frequency of humid heat events. You've probably noticed there's a bunch of colours going on in the background of this figure. That's to show whether we've got an El Nino event, which is red, or a La Nina, which is blue. And you can also see that where we've got the peaks in the purple and the green lines, they coincide with where we've got the El Nino events. What I want you to take away from this plot though, first, if we look at that green line, we can see this steady increase in the number of humid heat days, and this is averaged over land areas. So as an average, the world is seeing an increase in humid heat days. However, if we take this and normalise it by population, we get the purple line. So that's the number of heat days per person. And we can see this is steeper than the green line, which means that the humid heat days are increasing disproportionately over populated regions. So where it's more dangerous to humans is where we're getting these stronger increases. So you might be wondering, what does this mean for the future? And so we can take reanalysis data and use this to assess the ability of models to represent humid heat events in the past. So that's what we're going to be doing pretty soon. However, to be able to do that, it's important that we understand the reanalysis data does replicate what we see in the weather stations, which is what we're seeing in our results. And then once we're confident that the models can represent past change, we can use them to more confidently project future changes in humid heat events. If we think now about what this might mean for us, like personally, we might think about how we will adapt to these events if they're getting hotter. So if we just know that dry bulb temperatures or regular temperatures getting hotter in the future, we might think, okay, I want to cool down my house, so I might go out and buy an evaporative cooler. But if we don't also know that humidity is increasing, this might be an ineffective way of cooling, because evaporative coolers need to evaporate moisture into the air, just like when we sweat. But if the air is already humid, an evaporative cooler is not going to be as effective as it would be in a dry climate. However, if we know in the future we're going to get an increase in humidity on these extremely hot days, we might instead go out and purchase an air conditioner. And so this would then be a much more effective way of cooling us down in the future, because air conditioners, as well as cooling the air, they remove moisture. So they're not dependent on a dry climate to be able to cool the air. So to wrap up, we've seen that humid heats have become more frequent and they're getting hotter in many locations. We've also seen it's important to understand how humid heat may change in the future, as this will have implications for adaptation. And then the next steps for my team's research here at the Bureau will be looking into producing future projections of humid heat, so we can see, get a better idea of what changes we might be looking at in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cass. That was a really great explanation of humid heat events and, you know, helping to think about what we might expect in the future. Did anyone have any clarifying questions for Cass? Oh, I see there are some already in the chat. We'll ask a few now, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. So I think the first one is just saying, Cass, that we often hear that projections indicate that temperatures will increase. Do we know from the climate modelling if humidity will also go up? And I presume it depends on where you are, so it might be regionally focused. And if the models can output this, it would be good to document this alongside projected increases for an area. Yeah, any comments on that?
Yeah, so theoretically speaking, as the air gets warmer, it can hold more moisture. And so as temperatures increase, we would expect more humidity to be held in the air. But this is dependent on if there's moisture that can evaporate. So if we're looking at arid desert regions, if there's no moisture there, it's not going to be evaporated, even if the air can hold more moisture. So it's something that's an active area of research, looking at how well models can model moisture, and it's quite a difficult process because it's on such small scales, and models, as you saw, probably noticed from the figures there, the maps we see, they're quite blocky, and so we've got to try and make sure what the models see on this larger area actually represents the area, the smaller areas within that. So that's not a very clear answer. It's sort of watch this space. Hopefully we'll have a better picture of what's happening in the future, in the near future.
Yeah, no, that's great, Cass. And there were a couple of questions about, you know, showing the results for other capital cities, perhaps further north or in Perth, in Brisbane. But, you know, I know that this is sort of evolving research, like you said, and that I guess you'll keep working on this, and so there'll be more things coming out in the future. But yeah, it'd be great to hear from those. You know, personally, as a knowledge broker, I'd love to hear individually what some of the challenges you're having, and that's part of this discussion later today. So please keep the questions coming in and speak up. I will move on now. Thank you very much, Cass. We'll keep those questions coming into the Q&A, and we'll have more time at the end. But I want to give a warm welcome to Professor Ollie J, our next speaker. Thank you very much as a special guest today for explaining to us the impact of humid heat on our health. Ollie J is a professor of heat and health and the director of the Heat and Health Research Centre at the University of Sydney. His research has directly influenced international public health heatwave policies internationally, and he's been published in high-profile journals like Science and Nature. So we're very lucky to have Ollie here today to share his expertise. Over to you, Ollie. That sharing did work, and then you took it.
Sorry, I'm just coming back to the, here we go. Can you see that?
Yes, that's absolutely perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Ramona.
No worries.
Okay. First of all, just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. And thanks, Cass, for a terrific opening presentation. So I'll get straight into it. I think the first thing that is really important to keep at the center of our minds is while we're talking about hot weather, we're talking about humid weather, what we're really concerned about is the hot person in that hot and humid environment, because that's ultimately what translates into discomfort. And then that would then progress into health impacts if they're particularly severe. So I'll just start off just by revisiting this idea of the way in which humans interact with their surrounding environment and why humidity is so important for humans. So I'll present this in the context of something we call a human heat balance model. It's really quite straightforward. The first thing to keep in mind is that we're always generating heat inside the body. If you're alive, you've got cellular processes going on, and heat is a byproduct of cellular metabolism. So even sitting here right now, giving a presentation, I'll be generating around about 100 watts of heat. So that's equivalent to one of those old light bulbs that used to be very inefficient. And then if I start engaging in physical activity, then I'll start contracting skeletal muscles. They use a lot of oxygen, and that also increases the metabolic rate and increases the amount of heat that's been generated inside my body that I need to subsequently get rid of to stop myself from overheating. So we're generating heat inside the body, and we can lose heat from the skin surface to the surrounding environment by two predominant pathways. The first one is something called sensible heat loss. This is convection and radiation combined. And then we have the avenue of evaporative heat loss. So if there's one thing that I'd like everybody to take away from this call today, is that the production of sweat doesn't cool you down alone. That sweat has to evaporate in order to have a cooling effect. So keep that at the forefront of your mind as we're going through this. Now, if we can't balance that generation of heat inside the body with the combined heat loss from the skin surface to the surrounding environment via a combination of sensible heat loss and evaporative heat loss, I'll store inside the heat inside my body, and my body temperature will start to rise. And that can become problematic. And I'll describe how problematic that is in a little bit. Now, if we think about features of the environment that determine these heat transfer processes, from the perspective of sensible heat loss, the main thing that we're concerned about is air temperature. That's air temperature measured in the shade. If I'm thinking about evaporative heat loss, then what matters is the absolute amount of moisture in the environment, which is what humidity is. Now, if air temperature reaches 35 degrees Celsius, this is equivalent to the maximum skin temperature that we typically attain when we're fully responding physiologically to heat stress. And so if air temperature is equal to skin temperature, there's no temperature gradient or temperature difference between the outside of my body and the surrounding environment. So simple laws of thermodynamics tell us that all of a sudden now we won't be able to lose any heat via sensible heat loss. So what this means now is that we're still generating this heat inside our body, but we still need to lose this heat to stop ourselves from overheating. And now the only way when it's 35 degrees Celsius or warmer is through the evaporation of sweat. If we have high ambient humidity, this means that the ability to evaporate that sweat diminishes. And if we reach 100% relative humidity at that particular environment, that means that we're reaching a position where we're an adiabatic system, which over the course of successive hours might result in so much heat being stored inside my body simply from generating it and not being able to release it, that body temperatures will reach dangerous levels, and they may be sufficient to elicit heat-related illness or even heat-related death. Now, one last thing I'll just quickly clarify, or two things I'd like to clarify. It's not just temperature and humidity that determine our ability to keep cool in an environment. Keep in mind that air temperature is measured in the shade. So if you're in the sun, radiant temperature really matters. And we measure that with something called a black globe thermometer. And also wind really makes a difference to the ability of sweat to evaporate. One last thing I'll just mention, which was in response to one of the previous questions, is that I think the question was, is humidity projected to increase with climate change? It's really important to keep in mind that, as Cass said, as air temperature increases, the capacity of air to hold water moisture increases as well. So even if air temperature goes up and we get the same relative humidity, because it's a same percentage number of a bigger value, the absolute humidity will actually be greater, and that will be more oppressive in terms of thermoregulatory requirements, because it's the absolute amount of moisture in the air that determines our ability to keep cool. Okay, so what happens to the body when we start storing all this heat energy inside our body and our core temperature starts going up? Well, typically we regulate our body temperature around a set point of around about 37 degrees Celsius, give or take 0.5 degrees Celsius. And we have these physiological processes, sweating, and a process called vasodilation, which is a redistribution of blood away from the body core towards the skin surface that enable us to maintain that body temperature within a relatively safe range. But if core temperature increases to 39 or 40 degrees Celsius, we now have a very high increased risk of heat exhaustion, which is typified by symptoms such as vomiting, feeling faint, and things like this. If core temperature continues to rise and reaches around about 41 or even 42 degrees Celsius, there is a very real risk of death due to heat stroke. So I'll just quickly describe what heat stroke is. Heat stroke is basically down to the processes of the body that are trying to keep your body temperature in check. You're redirecting blood away from the body core towards the skin surface. This means that the gut is deprived of oxygen delivery via the bloodstream. When this is coupled with high local tissue temperatures, so local gut temperatures of 41 degrees Celsius or higher, the endothelial tissue in the gut starts to become leaky. These gap junctions that usually keep the nasty stuff inside our gut away from anything else start to become looser. Bacteria starts leaking across the gut and enters the circulation. This then sets off a sepsis response, results in mass coagulation, so blood clotting around the body, and ultimately death. So the term heat stroke is bandied around quite a lot. You don't get a touch of heat stroke. If you've got heat stroke, it's a very real medical emergency, to the point where the survival rate is 12% if a person is not adequately treated and rapidly treated. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. It's not just heat stroke that leads to heat-related death. We know that people with cardiovascular disease are at a much greater risk of cardiovascular collapse. This is not because they have problems regulating their body temperature. It's simply the process of regulating body temperature places excess strain on their heart, which they're unable to tolerate, which results in an increased risk of a catastrophic cardiovascular event. We also know that people with kidney disease are at a greater risk of renal collapse due to a redirection of blood flow away from the kidney tissues, but also these problems are also further exacerbated by progressive dehydration. So one question that many people might have is, well, we often get asked how hot is too hot, but how humid is too humid? And we're carrying out work at the University of Sydney that are trying to answer this particular question. And we were fortunate enough to have this work featured in Nature mid last year. So I'll quickly go through a paper that we published in Nature Communications back in 2023 that starts getting at what the true limits of human survival due to extreme heat and humidity may be. So we know that when we reach a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, so this is 35 degrees Celsius with 100% relative humidity, or a higher temperature with a lower relative humidity. We know that if we reach this threshold, the body becomes an adiabatic system, it can't lose any heat to the surrounding environment, and we effectively cook inside our own body heat after a 6-hour exposure. However, this threshold was proposed using a physical model. But what we know is that if we implement the limits of human physiology, most significantly limits to the ability to sweat in extreme heat environments, what we actually find when we integrate the limits of human physiology is that these maximum temperature and humidity combinations that we can survive the 6 hours in the shade resting are much cooler and drier than we previously thought. So that yellow area there differentiates the difference between the new model and the old model. So any conditions that fall within that orange area, we currently think are okay using the old model, which is the maximum limit of 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. But in fact, when you integrate human physiology, these are actually potentially deadly over 6 hours. What's important to keep in mind is this is a model for a young, fit, healthy, fully heat acclimatized person. As we age, primary aging results in a reduction in the ability to sweat. So if we look at the limits of human survival for heat stress and extreme heat and humidity, with an elderly person, the difference between the new model and the traditional wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius model becomes much greater. So this is quite confronting news because what we're seeing is that actually conditions that we previously thought were survivable are likely unsurvivable when we integrate the limits of human physiology. And when we integrate this into climate projections, the impacts of climate change are potentially much more severe, particularly for the elderly in our community. So these are models, and we're undertaking a lab study right now in the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, which is housed within the Heat and Health Research Centre at the University of Sydney, to actually test these limits of human survival under careful clinical supervision, of course, in human participants. This was featured by the ABC back in September. If anybody is interested in this, they can look at this article, and there's also an in-depth news piece that was done by Ty and Logan, which is available on YouTube as well. So that's the confronting evidence as to what the problem is. The question is, what can we do about it? So I'll hopefully leave everybody with a little bit of hope in terms of potential solutions moving forward. Back in 2021, we described something called the heat cascade. And what this essentially does is it identifies opportunities to implement interventions to reduce the impact of extreme heat and humidity that arise from hot weather systems. There are interventions that we can introduce at the landscape or urban level, such as an increase in blue infrastructure, such as rivers or lakes, or green infrastructure, such as trees. This can have a cooling effect in the environment. At the building level, we can mandate minimum requirements in terms of insulation, glazing, to reduce the transmission of extreme heat in the environment into the indoor environment where many of the most vulnerable are residing. This is still something that needs to be investigated. One of the big questions that gets asked is what's the maximum indoor the maximum indoor temperature for human health? And the answer is not readily available right now, and that's some work that we're embarking on to try to answer that question. And then there are things that we can do at the individual level. Of course, we can use air conditioning, but we can also modify other features of the environment, which are using more sustainable and low cost and accessible strategies to reduce the physiological heat strain that generates inside the body that is ultimately responsible for heat-related mortality and morbidity. And I described that earlier on. So back in 2021, I had the privilege of co-chairing the first ever Lancet series on heat and health with my colleague, Tony Capon, who's the director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute down in Melbourne, as well as Professor Chris Ebi, who's at the University of Washington in the United States. And in this series, we were able to summarize the physiological evidence supporting sustainable and accessible ways of keeping cool in a low resource environment. Having these publications are very nice, but it's really important that we translate this research findings, not just our own research findings, but the research findings of others that do this type of work around the world, into changes in policy and practice. So we've partnered with New South Wales Health to help reboot their Beat the Heat campaign, which happened last year, to deliver this evidence into changes in public health policy. Similarly, we've worked with the Victorian State Government to do a similar piece of work as well. And finally, I'll just draw your attention to a new tool that we've developed at the University of Sydney, which was sponsored by the New South Wales Government, which is something called the Heat Watch tool. So if you scan the QR code in the bottom right-hand side, that will take you to the web tool, and then you can load it on your phone as a home app as well, if you wish. This was co-designed with the community to ensure that the way in which we're delivering this heat health messaging is done in a way that really resonates with the people who need it the most. An important feature of this Heat Watch tool is that it enables users to provide individual level information such as age, whether they're on certain types of medication, whether they have a certain chronic disease, whether they own an air conditioner, and we generate a personal individual level profile in the tool, which then gives a individual level heat stress risk rating. Not only do we tell you what it is right now, we also tell you what it's going to be throughout the day and also over the coming 7 days. So we provide a 7-day forecast. A key feature of this work through the co-design process was the requirement to create multiple profiles. So what we heard from the communities that we were engaging with this work is they were asking us, well, we know that we'd like to know what our own heat stress risk is, but what we really want to know is what is the heat stress risk of my grandmother or my elderly neighbor, or maybe somebody, a loved one who is heat vulnerable that lives in a different postcode. So we created the capacity to generate multiple profiles with push notifications, which enable people to understand their own heat stress risk and what they can do to reduce that risk themselves. And also with the 7-day forecast, it also provides planning. So this is still a prototype tool. We're going to be further developing this over the coming couple of years, particularly providing a maps function so people can understand where their nearest cooling center is and how they can access it. Also giving people an opportunity to rate the quality of that cooling center and whether there are other facilities available to try to really deliver changes in public health policy into the hands of the people that need it the most. So I'll finish off there and be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. That was a great presentation again. And so I learnt so much. I've often thought that I've suffered, mild heat stroke before being out in the sun, but your explanation of heat stroke sounds much more serious. So clearly I didn't understand that. So that was great that you explained that. And I think that the Heat Watch app is really, really important and great that that's being developed that can help in those situations. Are you getting a lot of interest and uptake from that app?
Yeah, so currently the Queensland government on their heat health page recommend or have a link to the Heat Watch app straight away. The New South Wales Health also recommend or have a link to the Heat Watch app on their webpage as well. So the next stage is actually to undertake a randomized control trial to actually assess the efficacy of that tool for reducing heat health outcomes. So we're currently preparing an NHMRC partnership grant for that project, and that will also engage other communities in the co-design process as well. So one of the things that we're very conscious of right now is that the tool is delivers only in English. So we'd like to translate it, but also it's not just a direct translation. It's a matter of also understanding that there's other ways of describing information that resonate with certain communities. So better understanding that and building that into the tool is going to be a really important component of the tool moving forward. And then actually then generating gold standard evidence to understand how well this tool is reducing heat health outcomes, and generate data as well to show the prevalence of heat health impacts in the community. That's great. Yeah, that's really that is really a good positive thing to do with the risk that was obviously is increasing as Cass mentioned. So it's now time for the Q&A part. So we've had a lot of questions come in already in the Q&A function. So that's great. Please keep the questions coming. Just to start, I think there's a few questions already. So just to summarize some of the questions that Cass mentioned in your talk, you mentioned, Cass, that humid heat events, we've seen them increase, and you showed some data from the cities, from a few cities where most people live, the large population in Australia. And Ollie, you mentioned influencing building codes and how we can adapt other than just, everyone getting air conditioning. There were some questions about urban greening, like when we're planning our communities and our cities, would things like urban greening increase the humidity of those areas or decrease? Have you got either of you have any comments on that question? Yeah, I can respond to that, Ramona, if you like. So increasing green infrastructure such as trees. There's the aspect of evapotranspiration. So the idea that you have moisture that evaporates from the leaves or the foliage, which then has a cooling effect. It's basically the same way an evaporative cooler works. But as I think Cass mentioned in her talk, is that evaporative coolers don't work particularly well in humid environments, and so that aspect, even though they will be relatively well ventilated in an outdoor environment, it'll probably blunt the cooling effect of trees. But at the same time, tree infrastructure obviously provides shade, and it's really important to keep in mind that temperatures are by convention measured in the shade. And if you're out in the sun, you're exposed to black globe temperatures that are as much as 15 or 17 degrees Celsius higher than ambient temperature in the shade. So if you're not getting a massive evaporative transpiration cooling effect from trees, you're still getting the benefit of additional shading. From a blue infrastructure perspective, same principles, but also blue infrastructure helps reflect direct radiation as well. So that has benefits as well in terms of trying to keep the net heat load reduced.
That's great. And there are lots of questions for you, Cass, that I think a lot about, your future plans of the research and things that I think is still evolving. And I think it comes down to some of the challenges of a lot of the questions, if I can summarize them, are talking about the challenges of looking at this information in projections. And I think, is there any comments that you'd like to make, just summarising some of the points that have been pulled out from the audience?
Yeah. So I also saw the question about trends for Perth or other northern regions. I have included. I realise most of the cities I included are not from the most hot and humid parts of the country. I've included Broome there so we've got some tropical representation, but this is just some really recent research, and I just haven't had the time yet to look at everywhere. So Perth, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to look at, so can't comment on trends there yet. But that's on the cards for research I'll be doing soon. For the future projections, that's not something we've started yet, but it's also something we're planning to do in the near future. So again, can't really comment on that yet, but hopefully, not immediately. It's not going to be like the next few months or something, but hopefully we'll have that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I think, obviously there's a lot of interest from the audience, a lot of interest into, their understanding that this is a risk and that they want to, we have a lot of people here that I think are experiencing humid heat challenges in their organisations and their areas, and they really are after more and more information. It's very obvious from all the questions about, could this be included in a heatwave warning service, and wanting to understand what this means in the future so that they can adequately plan. And I think if you have a look at the explainer that I quickly flashed up before on our website, that we've worked to really try to unpack why there are some challenges in, even understanding the historical events, and why Cass's work is so important to understand historical humid heat events and then understand how they might change in future conditions, and how we, can then better project with that. And other states and territories are working on giving, communicating, like the Queensland Future Climate Dashboard actually has some indications of future heat waves there, humid heat events there that are really, really important for those users. So I think there's a lot of questions here that I really wanted to use this opportunity as well to put a call out to the audience to say, can you share some examples of what you're experiencing in your own organisations and areas, so that we can help to shape this future research that we're talking about? You've already put a lot of things in there where you feel like that would help. And one that's just been put in now is interest from the AFL, sporting organisations, managing heat stress, and wondering what it would take for organisations to become champions, awareness of action. Ollie, do you have anything that you've worked on with sporting organisations?
Yeah, Ramona, thank you. Yeah, so we're engaging many sports organisations across Australia. So we've worked with the Australian Open since 2018 we've developed a new extreme heat policy and heat stress management system for them, and we've run it now for the 7th year running. We've worked with Cricket Australia. We've worked with Sports Medicine Australia to develop a nationwide heat policy for community sports. So I saw there was one question earlier on from I can't remember. I think it's from Justin, who's asking about temperature and humidity levels for education departments for restricting outdoor play for students. Yeah. So we have there's a tool which is very similar to the HeatWatch tool, but it's for sport. And so if you go into Google and you type in SMA heat policy, maybe put Sydney at the end of it, that will take you to a similar tool. And what that's doing is delivering the Sports Medicine Australia heat policy that we developed for that organisation back in 2021. And you can enter the sport that you're playing, the location that you're in, and then it will tell you what the risk level is for people playing those sports at different times. We provide a forecast as well for that. So we're working with all these organisations. We've been speaking with the AFL as well. They have typically fewer heat stress problems because of the timing of their season. But with AFLW, play's been taking place earlier in the year, so that's been more of a concern from a heat stress perspective. So we're working closely with most of these sports organizations, major sports organizations, to ensure that their policies are driven by the best available evidence in terms of heat stress risk management, and also interpreting it in a way which can optimize the safety, but also optimize the opportunity to play as well. One of the things that we always want to avoid is being so overcautious that we're basically telling people to stop doing something when it's perfectly safe to do so. So actually having this evidence-based framework in place is really important. So I think that probably addresses that question.
Mm. And I guess that, thank you, Ollie, and that sort of goes into another question where that was asking about, have we seen the heat safe, the heat wet safe strategies that you're advocating, have they been, is there research out there to show that these are being taken up by people, and have they improved health outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, that's still a big question. So the work that we've done is that these are predominantly climate chamber studies that are answering the question in that context. But the next step is then to derive field-based evidence of the efficacy of these strategies. So part of that project is going to be rolled into our Heat Watch project that we're looking to get funded through the NHMRC Partnership Grant program.
There's a question here about just delving in a bit more about the external conditions identified that are known to create heat, like you talked about. There's, what we're really interested in with keeping people safe is what's the temperature for internal spaces that people can cope with. So thinking about guiding building codes to set a minimum standards on overheating, but it's hard to, like, I know I'm we're starting a project as well in the Nest Climate Systems Hub to try to help address that, to look at what the future extreme heat events will be. So trying to understand how we do understand what external conditions can do. How do we match that up with the internal? Is there? It's not simple. So is there ways that you've seen that we could do that better?
No, well, I think, I guess there's two questions there, really. The first one, which is probably the most important one, is what is the maximum indoor temperature for health? And so this is a question that many jurisdictions are asking across the world. I would strongly urge anybody who's embarking on that type of work to place the human at the center of that question. What we know is that temperature, humidity, airflow all determine that critical temperature. We also need to make sure that those, we can model it out, but then we need to verify or validate those models with human data from the perspective of not just discomfort, but also really health outcomes as well. So I think that's a really important perspective, I think, moving forward with that question. In terms of translating outdoor conditions into indoor conditions, that's really challenging because it obviously depends an awful lot on the built environment, materials. There are modeling packages that are available to do that. So you can have, our colleagues in architecture, for example, they have software where they can create certain profiles of buildings. So examples of buildings that might be prevalent, and then approximate what the indoor conditions would be for a given set of outdoor conditions throughout the day. And obviously there's offset in terms of time and everything. But that's obviously very it's a very complicated business.
Yes. I think, Cass, there's a question here for you that might be, if you could comment on that current weather apps don't provide wet bulb temperature, but sometimes the dew point. So could you mention, could you advise us if you think that that's a useful metric to help guide the public to monitor heat stress? Or perhaps that's a question a bit for Ollie too, but yeah, is dew point a useful metric?
So what I often look at on the Bureau's weather app, where we've got regular temperatures, like the main temperature forecast we have, we then also have feels like temperature. And so feels like includes humidity, I think also wind speed. It's something that includes not just temperature, and that you'll see on a humid day will be higher than the regular temperature, or compared to, yeah, so it'll feel hotter than it is if it's also humid. That's what I'd probably suggest people look at. Dew point can also be useful. I find it a bit less intuitive to understand though. It's basically the closer the dew point is to the regular temperature, the more humid it is. But yeah, I tend to go for the apparent temperature, or that feels like temperature.
Yes, I do like the feels like.
I might just quickly jump in, Ramona, if that's okay,
Yes.
with a follow-up response as well. I think it's important to keep in mind that those feel like temperatures, I believe, are for a fixed set of circumstances. So it's not necessarily translatable if you are exercising, for example, or you're out in direct solar radiation. If you're out in the sun, you're going to feel a lot hotter than that. Another thing is that the feels like temperatures it's quite instructive in humid environments, but in dry environments, what we find is that actually the limitation to the ability to keep cool is your ability to sweat in the first place, not necessarily the climate restricting that sweat from evaporating. So it underestimates risk in very hot and dry climates. And it also depends on what outcome you're interested in. So one thing I would say is that if people are concerned about health outcomes, then the HeatWatch app is a good tool, because basically integrates all of that weather information. It integrates temperature, integrates humidity, it estimates wind speed. You can tell it whether you're inside or outside, so whether you're in the sun or if you're in the shade. And then it also adjusts the risk for other features of you. So, you know, there's, I know, hundreds of people on this call, and we'll all respond slightly differently to the same set of conditions. But we can describe some of that variability based on things like age, whether you're on certain types of medication, whether you have certain chronic disease, at least from a health risk perspective. And so what the HeatWatch tool does, it delivers that information to you, and it's kind of tailored for you in terms of your risk. And it also tells you in a kind of really simple way. It just says whether your risk is low, medium, high, very high, et cetera, et cetera. So in that type of way, it helps interpret all this information that we have.
Yeah, that sounds really a really great tool. And as you mentioned, it's been developed, co-designed with the users. So that is a great approach to get something really fit for purpose. So thanks, Ollie. That's great. We have had so much interest, so many questions. I feel like we will have to follow up with some. We'll work with our experts, and we will do our best to answer all the questions if we can, and provide a way to get it back to you, potentially a blog or some kind of response to people that have provided their names. We can get in touch. So thank you very much for all your questions. I'm sorry we've come to the end of our time, but I really wanted to say thank you so much to both of the presenters, to Ollie and Cassandra, for the presentations. Really learnt a lot, and thank you so much to the audience for the active participation, obviously really engaged and really interested in this topic. I also would like to thank you all for supporting the NESP Climate Systems Hub webinar series, and we'd really hope that you learned something, and that we'd like to stay connected and continue these discussions about extreme climate events that you have to deal with. We've also got some great more webinars lined up for the rest of the year, so please go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get that in your email inbox, and you'll know what's coming up. And we also have LinkedIn and other channels to promote. So please spread the word to anyone you think would be interested. And also please email us on info@nesp2climate.com.au if you've got any suggestions or feedback for us on our webinars, or suggestions for further topics in the future. And you can also go, through the website, and as we mentioned, there's lots of good resources on there to try to help you understand, build your capacity in future climate. And before we finish, we'd really value your feedback. So we've put the survey, we will put the brief survey that we have in the chat, and we'd really appreciate a few minutes for us to give you, if you could please give us your feedback. But yes, thank you again to our presenters. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes who have made it happen today. And yeah, with that, I will see you all next time. Thank you very, very much.